Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Sue-Ann. I work at Grosvenor as an evaluation specialist, and I'm also a member of the AES Victorian Regional Network Committee, who have organised today's seminar. So I guess, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which we're dialing in today. So Kristy, Eleanor, and I are all sitting in the same room, which is why you might see weird new things going on. So we're all dialing in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I just wanted to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I invite you to share the traditional lands from which you're dialing in from as well in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. So a bit of an introduction for anyone who hasn't attended an AES regional seminar before. This seminar is aimed at our local AES Victorian network members, but it's of course open to anyone from any location, including both AES and non-AES members. So the committee, if you haven't been to an event before, we organise a range of free events throughout the year on a wide range of topics pertaining to evaluation. So I'd really encourage everyone to keep an eye on the AES professional learning calendar on the website. And these events are also a really great opportunity for networking with other members. As you can see, we've got 40 people climbing on the chat. Great opportunity to get to know other people in our local evaluation community, whether or not you're a seasoned evaluator or new to the field. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this seminar on everyday ethics in evaluation and extend a warm welcome to presenters, Kristy Hornby and Eleanor Williams. So Kristy, who you can see on the line, Kristy works with me here at Grosvenor. She's got over a decade of evaluation experience here at Grosvenor, and her expertise spans the Victorian state government, federal government, local government, and not-for-profit sectors. I'm not gonna give away too much of her introduction because I'm sure she can introduce herself much better than I can. But I'll just introduce our next speaker as well, who's Eleanor Williams. I'm sure everyone, if most of you, if not everyone, knows, is the Managing Director of the Australian Centre for Evaluation, and she established the Australian Public Sector Evaluation Network in 2019. And Eleanor is currently undertaking PhD research on evidence use in fast-paced policy contexts. So a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to them for more detailed introductions and to get into it. The session is being recorded, as we said, will be available on the YouTube channel. Kristy and Eleanor will present for about 50 minutes, and then we'll open up for a bit of Q&A and a discussion, but please feel free to, oh, thank you. The people in the waiting room are able to get in. That should do it. Sorry, I was just letting in some stragglers in the waiting room. So Kristy and Eleanor will present for about 15 minutes, but please pop your questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on it and raise it to the attention of Kristy and Eleanor. Now, I'll just say, are there any other tech issues that anyone's having before I hand over to these guys? I think everyone's
good.
Great.
Great. Thanks so much, Sue-Ann. And look, thank you all for joining us. So this is a topic that is very dear to my heart and to Kristy's. And I thought with the title of this slide is quite provocative, isn't it? Why do we think we have something useful to share? I guess Kristy and I have been talking about this topic for about a year now. So in the lead up to the AES conference last year, Kristy came to me and a couple of others and said, hey, I reckon I've got this topic which is worth discussing, which is quite often in our evaluation practice, we hit these things which aren't about formal ethics. This is not about going through the hoops and the requirements for the formal ethic process, which is very important, has a very important role in research and evaluation, but it's about the smaller everyday things that you hit along the way. And so really, Kristy and I come at this one as practitioners. This isn't about kind of a theoretical, this isn't sort of about our academic work. This is just really, as practitioners, we wanted to share this question of like, well, how do we think about the ethical challenges that we come up with in our day-to-day practice, and what should we do about them? How do we start a conversation about a more proactive approach as the evaluation community to dealing with this everyday ethics issue? And I know Kristy put this slide together particularly to highlight it's the things that will come out of left field. It's not the thing you were planning for. It's the shark that comes out of the water. If I go back a slide 2, just in terms of how we'll come at the conversation today, we'll provide a little bit of background and context, the lay of the land. But one of the main things that we did want to share today is we've been, after the conversation that was had at the AES conference last year, where we did collect a little bit of data through a Mentimeter at the time. And I guess what it showed is that these ethical issues are really common, that everybody faces them day to day. It's not a thing just some evaluators hit. Everybody will face it at some point. And so we decided to do a follow-up survey to try and get a little bit more depth in those findings. So we wanted to share what we're hearing from the survey today, and I think we've just got over 80 responses at the moment. We also, given this is a community of evaluators, we thought it was worth stepping through some of the things we learned about designing and delivering the survey, because evaluators will give you feedback on your survey when you do collect data. And we think it was useful, like we're coming at this in a really open-minded way and just keen to find out what we hear, and we're hoping to present again at this year's AES conference to try and take this conversation a little bit further with a little bit more detail about the experiences of the evaluation community. We also want to share some resources that help you think about ethics in evaluation. This isn't a brand new topic. We're not the first people to think about it, but we do want to have a really practical conversation, but we don't want to ignore the great work that's gone before. And so we thought we'd point to a couple of those things. And then we also just wanted to open up, given that you're the ethics passionate people who've decided to attend, we think there's a bit more that that we can do with an engaged community as well. So we did want to just touch a couple of opportunities there to get involved in the work. And with that, I'll hand over to Kristy just to give a bit more of the colour and movement of her experiences and why we think this is worth tackling as a topic.
Thanks, Eleanor. So this was an experience that I had at the back end of 2022. So naturally, you have to put your submissions up, for the AES in advance. So this was a couple of years prior to the AES conference last year that we presented on this topic about. And I've been an evaluator for a long time. It was about a decade of practice at that period. But I came across this experience that just really shook me and also made me think about, these experiences are almost a bit of taboo in our profession. We don't really talk about everyday ethics or perhaps the underbelly or the grey in our work. So this sort of experience I had was the genesis for that reach out to Eleanor, to Mandy Charman of the Open Network, and the sort of catalyst for that session. So I just want to share that experience with those on the line here again to understand why I felt it was so important and why I think there was, there's a conversation to be had here across the Australian evaluation community. So in that year, I was doing a fairly standard evaluation. I was doing an evaluation for a government department. They were running a program that had about 150 grants. And so our methodology was nothing too exciting, pretty vanilla, if you will, a desktop review of existing program data and documentation, some surveys, some consultations. So nothing, rocket science. It all sort of happened when I came to the findings presentation. And so doing the early testing and socialization of the findings with the client, I sort of presented a snapshot of where their 150 grants were sitting at in terms of their progress. And this was drawn directly from their own project management tool. So imagine a spreadsheet and you've got row A and it talks about grant A, and grant A is at 80% completion. And grant B is at 60% completion, grant C is at 90% completion. You get the drift, and so on for 150 rows for each of these 150 grants. This data set was pretty normally distributed, and this was in the August of that year when I was delivering the findings. After that session, I then went to write the draft evaluation report, and I asked for the September data set of that program management tool so that I could include the most up-to-date progress tracking of those 150 grants. And so between August to September, each of those 150 grants, which had been delivered across an 18-month period, were miraculously at 100%. So grant A was at 100%, grant B was at 100%, grant C was at 100%. All 150 grants somehow got to 100% completion in September from a normally distributed data set in August of 150 grants across an 18-month period. Naturally, that was a big, giant, screaming red flag for me, that perhaps there had been some manipulation of the data set. Luckily, in that instance, I was working with an entity that had an internal evaluation unit, so I escalated the issue and the risk to them, and they were able to work with myself and the program area to resolve the situation to my satisfaction. So we mitigated the impact on ethical delivery in that instance. But it sort of gave me pause for reflection, where in my decade-long career, I've only had 2 instances of that level of, ethical, unethical behaviour that I've seen. And that one in particular made me ponder, in an economic and fiscal situation where many entities, government and non-government alike, are, constrained for funding, where there's increased pressure on budget bids, and, many people's roles are tied to the funding, their program funding. We're sort of seeing an environment that's ripe for this kind of unethical behaviour, intentionally or unintentionally by program areas to perhaps influence the outcomes of their evaluation to achieve the ultimate results that they want for their program and their funding and so forth. So it was really this question of me going, I've had this experience, like around the traps, I hear other people have had similar experiences, but we don't really come out as a profession and talk about it, and importantly, talk about what to do. So in our little, conspirator gang of Eleanor and Mandy and myself at the time, Mandy did some research and found there's not really any guidance on this. So, as per Eleanor's overview, there's a lot of material around, human research ethics. There's also a lot of material around things like conflicts of interest and procurement processes and gifts, benefits and hospitality. But there's not a lot of information about the grey space between evaluators, program areas and commissioners, and those day-to-day interactions and the ethical conundrums and everyday ethics challenges that can arise. So it was a real life, VUCA situation where there was volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And that's where we're interested in exploring more and sharing back with you what we've learned and thought about so far. So I'll pass back to Eleanor for that.
Yeah, and so we had this conversation and we thought what we put to the AES conference is to say we made a very rough kind of framework, and we called it at that time the good, the bad, the ugly. And we tried to pull out some of the sort of examples which were further down. So I think Kristy's example where you're talking about blatant change of results, that's pretty bad. And I think we put that in the ugly result. We were talking about there's also, if you wanted to use the term good, you'd say, look, there's things where you've been asked by a commissioner to change the wording to make it more palatable for the people at the other end. And it will definitely give you that feeling of, I'm not sure as an evaluator whether that's okay, but maybe you work through it and say, look, the actual substantive point holds. So we don't think it's changing the substantive meaning. Maybe it makes it so the whole report, people can be more receptive to the findings of the report. That's probably fine. It's, we present an ethical challenge, but we were able to work through it and we've made a reasonable call. There's things which are probably, commissioners going too far in trying to sort of wrangle who you're speaking to and not speaking to, but maybe you can negotiate your way out of that. That's bad. And then there's the really bad of changing findings. So we made this very loose, high-level framework. We took it to the AES conference and we did a bit of audience participation throughout. So we had 70 people participating in the Menti. There were a few more in the room. And we really wanted to get a sense like, is this something you've seen as well? Here's some examples of the ethical challenges we face. Are these things you've seen as well? And of the 70 people who came back to us, it was that adds up to about 40% said they either occasionally, often or regularly had seen these kind of ethical concerns. And we thought, look, that's pretty substantial. It's a big chunk of the people who are there, and it's probably worthy of a bit more of a deep dive. And probably also through that conversation, we realised our good, bad and ugly framework was a bit rough and ready. And it was worth a bit more thinking, especially once we got that input from the audience. Actually, they'd put some more examples on the table and we felt it was a little bit more differentiated. So if we move to the next slide, what we did next is we sort of took away those findings and we said, okay, well, let's break it into, we think actually it's probably minor, moderate, major and critical. And so that's trying to break out that middle section a little bit into bad but not too bad and a bit worse and then very bad. Because particularly when we worked through the examples, and I won't expect you to read everything on this slide. We'll provide them later, and they do appear in a blog post as well that we did afterwards. And what we tried to do is just give a bit more of a sense of how serious the breaches are. And it's really, it's a combination of sort of the severity, but also the transparency. How bad's the situation? How transparent were the commissioners or the stakeholders who are causing the problem? And we broke it out into these 4 levels. And what we wanted to do from there is try and get a little bit more systematic to understand people's engagement with these sorts of levels of challenges, and start to get a sense also of how people tend to deal with these challenges as well. So we're really trying to work up to the point where we do have something a bit more concrete from a research perspective that we can share with the evaluation community to talk about the frequency of these experiences and how they're generally managed, with the objective of being able to say, okay, then we think we can provide some slightly more concrete guidance, community-led, out back into the evaluation community.
Eleanor, just wondering when you're in the framework. So there's a comment there about how this would fall into the area of research integrity, and there is literature and frameworks around that. Just wondering if it's worth talking about intersection between what's available for research ethics and governance and integrity guidelines, and how that applies to evaluation or
absolutely
clarity.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point. This isn't blue skies space. We did think that the sort of challenges that evaluators generally face are slightly different than researchers, although there's a lot of commonality. That question of manipulation of findings, for instance, is a common one. I think that the slight difference is the nature of evaluation is, and I guess most of our work we're thinking about a commissioner that's generally either in the government or not-for-profit sector, and then a delivery agent, and that relationship is has some tensions in it, in that a product's being procured, so there is some expectation of delivering a product to satisfaction. But being an evaluation, it might tell you some hard truths that you have to deal with, and so it's slightly different than something usually in research. It's less of an emotive topic, it's less of a judgmental topic, in that it's not saying was the program or policy that you're quite invested in good or bad or indifferent. It's that judgment that creates a lot of the tension and the temptation to change either the nature of the results or how the results are framed, and that's when we get into this challenging dynamic. And there's a broader debate, I guess, about the challenges for in-house evaluators versus external evaluators. I think they've got similar but slightly different challenges, in that one's got a commercial relationship and one's got an organisational relationship. And either way, I guess what you're hoping is that you can preserve the quality of the relationship between the commissioner and the evaluator at the end. And that's what makes this particularly hard as compared to other research ethics. But that's not to say there's not a lot we can learn, and that's why we are keen to point to some of the existing resources that exist in this space, because there is advice out there about how to manage your ethical practice, and a lot of it's about clarity and transparency about what you're going to do, how it will be reported, and that helps kind of ward against this temptation to change what you report on. And good point. So I see in the comments too, it's just saying it is a slightly different question about integrity and ethics. I think as a Venn diagram, it would probably be quite a neat one, where there's definitely a crossover space and some things that sit separately. Then I think if we just go to the next slide, one thing we just wanted to emphasise too is we actually still have the survey open. So if you're attending this but you haven't had a chance to look at the survey, we'd absolutely love your participation, because we really are trying to get that depth. And we'll close the end of May, but if you can take a look at that maybe after this, and share with your networks, we're really keen to just, if this sort of raises things for you to hear your thoughts as well. Then I'll hand back to Kristy just for what we're seeing initially.
Yep. And a further plug for the survey, it'll only take you about 20 minutes, and then we're asking you to take that extra 5 minutes to share through your networks, for the simple fact that, there's no magical universal list of all Australian evaluators, commissioners and program areas subject to evaluation. We are having to do snowball sampling through this, so that the more you can help, the broader coverage we'll get. I think that was a fascinating question posed by the attendee as well. So a couple of extra thoughts on that. I think it was Carol Weiss who said, evaluations are generally political. So that's also another different, layer to research, not just that, evaluations can be more emotive, but they can also be more political or symbolic than pure research. And Eleanor's point as well about, the tensions faced by external and internal evaluators. I actually feel as an external evaluator, I've got a lot of power and ability to manage those situations. If there's a challenge that I don't feel is resolved effectively, I can, in the very worst instance, cancel the contract and walk away. Internal evaluators who have to keep working with that person or individual or that program area have less power. They've got less wriggle room and ability to move. So there's different but similar challenges, and that's also what we're hoping to flesh out through this. So to touch on a little bit of what we've learned so far, the most frequent issues reported, so over on the left-hand side, people have said the most common thing they're seeing is that evaluations aren't providing complete descriptions of findings, limitations and conclusions to all stakeholders, unless doing so would violate legal and proprietary obligations. That in layman's terms is the cherry picking, right? So that's a common issue that we would all come across. So it's probably unsurprising that this was rated as the most frequent. The number 2, 3 and 4 there were sort of equal ties for the second most frequent observed issues. The item number 2 there, not clarifying and specifying the individual and cultural values underpinning purposes, processes and judgments. That also speaks to Eleanor's point and the point that I emphasised around evaluations being political. By the nature of evaluations containing values, you're picking what's important to the research, to what you investigate and don't investigate. So if there's imbalance between those making the decision of the values and what's essentially in scope and those not, that can lead to that everyday ethics challenge. Point 3 there, evaluations are not openly and honestly identifying and addressing real or perceived conflicts of interest that may compromise the evaluation. So in the internal evaluator context, there may be actual or implied pressure on them to achieve a certain result. With external evaluators, there may be commercial pressures placed on an evaluator to achieve a certain result. So there are particular pressures and challenges that are applied within that political system, which can inherently come up with conflict of interest by their very nature between someone buying or requiring something and someone delivering that thing. On point 4 there, evaluation communications not having adequate scope and guard against misconceptions, biases, distortions and errors. And that 4th point sort of echoes the cherry picking point. So again, something that I think is quite common, that we experience across our profession is either people actually or being tempted to cherry pick our findings, conclusions and recommendations. In the middle column there, these are the top 3 most severe issues reported to date. So evaluations not being designed and conducted to protect human and legal rights and maintain the dignity of participants and other stakeholders. I've got some quotes on the next page, but some of that was talking about, the Western paradigm that's often applied to evaluation and not being recognising and respectful of and attuning to different cultural frameworks and norms and ways of doing, being and knowing that are out there. As well as the power imbalance perhaps between evaluation participants, evaluators and commissioners as well. Issues of informed consent being reported through the verbatim responses too. Number 2 there, you see the same as in the most frequent issues around those conflict of interest. And number 3 as the most severe identified is evaluation agreements not being negotiated to make those obligations explicit and take into account those needs, expectations and cultural contexts of clients and other stakeholders. So again, we're essentially talking about values. What I found interesting comparing those 2 columns is what I wanted to see was the comparison between frequency and severity. So, are the most severe things the highest frequency or are they lower frequency? What's the overlap? So you can see that overlap between conflict of interest, but so far with the data as of yesterday, noting there's still 25 odd days for the research to go, there's not a high degree of overlap between the highest frequency and the highest severity issues in what's being reported through respondents to the survey. So that gives me heart that, while there are known challenges, particularly appearing in that left-hand column around the theme of values and cherry picking, they're not necessarily the most severe ones that we're seeing every single time. Over on the right-hand side, we also asked respondents a question around, well, what's your level of comfort in navigating everyday ethics issues? Unsurprisingly, the more severe an issue was in the rating table we provided, the comfort level decreased proportionally. So there you can see only 7% of respondents were extremely comfortable dealing with issues that had a severe impact on ethical delivery. That went up to 9 with major, the next lowest severity, 15%, 37% with minor, and 60% with no issues that had no impact on ethical delivery. I found 2 things fascinating about that statistic to date. So the first is that decline. It's not surprising that perhaps people that have been in the field for longer or have had more exposure that there's a correlation between comfort and their, the level of severity they feel they can manage. The second observation was, as a profession, we don't seem very comfortable in general. So that only 60% said they were extremely comfortable dealing with, contexts that had no impact on ethical delivery was really fascinating, because then there's 40% sitting there that don't feel extremely comfortable in any context. So I feel that's something we could dig further in, perhaps this research or future research. I wanted to just let some of the comments from the respondents to date sort of speak for themselves. So I've put them over on the left-hand side there, and I'll pause for a moment just to allow people to digest. But I think those 4 comments are representative of an experience most, if not all of us, have had in our careers.
Well, John, we could take turns reading them if you wanted.
Yeah, let's do that. You go.
Okay, I'll do the first one. So it goes, an evaluation report was edited by the director without any consultation with evaluators, internal staff. A recommendation to address key feedback from staff regarding staff attrition, pay levels and impact on program delivery was removed. 2 other recommendations were added by the director, which had no relationship to the evaluation.
The next one is, I carried out an evaluation of an organisation initiative whose findings cast management and leadership in a negative light. In the end, the report did not see the light of day.
Yeah, really common challenge. I'm tempted to do voices, but it'll be weird. This next one, our key project contact is new to the department and extremely difficult to work with, to the point of being obstructive. We suspect that they lie and tell different information to different people, both internally and to us.
Yeah. So that's where you can also see the emotion coming through the responses. So each of these snippets, there was much more to each response provided by each respondent. So it's clearly an issue we feel passionate about. But the last one there in the blue, most evaluation funders, external evaluators, etc., privilege Western ethical frameworks. This creates everyday ethical challenges for First Nations organisations looking to embed and practice culturally modelled ethical frameworks and evaluations. There were lots of verbatim responses. So there was about 20 to 25 responses in there, if not more. And so I just want to thank those who have responded to date, and those of you who might complete our survey for the generosity in providing that open and unvarnished sharing of your experience. It's really valuable, and we do want to pay respect and homage to those experiences through this research and through any guiding material we might develop out of it. The last piece I want to touch on is over on the right hand there. Who's responding? So, this was a survey that we've had snowball distribution kindly through the AES and through our own personal and organisational networks, and we've asked others to carry that distribution on. So far 36% are external evaluators, 29% are internal evaluators, but those that are from a function or division different to the program being evaluated. 23% are also internal evaluators, but they're embedded in the same function or division of the program being evaluated. What really also gave me heart is that the remaining 12% are evaluation commissioners from program areas subject to evaluators, evaluation participants, policymakers, program designers, or other respondents. So a couple of people responded saying they'd been on HREX and held that sort of ethics assessment position of responsibility. So I love that we're hearing through this, not just the voice of evaluators, but we're also getting a snippet into the experience of those other parts of the triad, the evaluator, the commissioner, the program areas, and as an overlay, the participants as well. So that's sort of your taster of the response and results so far. So please do contribute to that to make our picture even more beautiful and interesting. As Eleanor said as well, we've learned a lot through this process and want to, with that spirit of continuous improvement, share our learnings back on the process, design and execution itself to the Australian evaluation community. So there's been 2 main learnings we've had so far on that point. So the snowball recruitment's actually worked way better than expected. So in terms of our reach, we've had about 160 people as of yesterday click on the yes, I consent to do this survey. Only 80 of them or so have translated to actually answering the first question. But 160 people seeing it, clicking through, clicking the first question is beyond my wildest dreams. I thought we might hit 100 people sort of seeing and engaging with it. So that's been really fascinating. I think a success factor there has been having an extended open period. So it's been open, it will be open for 3 months. So I think allowing that time for it to percolate through all our networks, through all the people participating and passing it on, for all the organisations supporting and championing it and including in your newsletters. I think that extended open period has helped, as well as multiple collaborative partners who are pushing it out through their network. So we've been grateful to have not just Grosvenor and ACES network, but also the Centre for Child and Family, Excellence in Child and Family Welfare Open Network, spearheaded by Mandy Charman, pushing it out. Paul Ramsay Foundation through School Main pushing it out, as well as the Assessment and Evaluation Research Centre through Amy Gullickson pushing it out. So we've been lucky to have quite a wide reach, and that's been really fascinating for doing some novel exploratory research on this sort of tentative topic we wanted to learn more about. That's actually worked better than we expected. The thing that did not work so well and that we've got lots of feedback on has been the scales. So if you've completed the survey to date, or if you're about to, there's two main sets of scales that make up the body of the core questions. One's about the frequency and one's about the severity. The idea and the intent was looking at some other studies into similar topics from the American Evaluation Society and work done for the AES that were open-ended and that required a lot of coding. The idea was to take an existing framework, and in this case, the AEA's professional evaluation standards, and have closed questions so we could more clearly assess severity and frequency against, those closed questions and have better statistics for analysing and making meaning of. What happened is, it turns out the PES, the professional evaluation standards, weren't quite fit for purpose for that, where they often had 2 or 3 different ideas, within each standard, and it didn't translate using a double negative to the scale rating. So that hasn't worked quite as well as we expected. So for those that have struggled through, thank you, we understand, and apologies, and we'll just keep learning from this and going forward. So we've got a lot of, we're just having powerful challenges in the room. So the excitement of live presentations. In that kind of consistency and clarity of analysis, it just caused confusion for many respondents. So thanks for bearing with us, and just wanted to share that learning and insight back to others in the community as well. This one's me as well. So where to from here? So the survey that we've posted in the chat, and we'll post again, closes end of May. We'll then be getting stuck into across June and July survey analysis. We have an optional question in there where people can provide their details to be contacted for a case study interview. So far 8 people have provided their details, which is again very generous and kind of them. We'll reach out to those people and have those case study interviews and bring more light and colour to this. We're also aspiring to do a literature review and develop indicative findings from that. And if we're successful with our proposal, because it's all subject to AES's decision making and the wonderful, Canberra committee making that decision, we'll share the findings of the AES conference and perhaps produce additional supporting artefacts, maybe blogs or quick papers or resources. So we really want to, as I said, do homage to the generous feedback everyone's provided and share that back out in the community with this interesting, and topical area that we don't generally talk about much. Let's bring some light to that greyness. I'll pass back to Eleanor to take us out.
So just Kristy, sort of say thanks to everyone. There are quite a few suggestions in the chat about where to go next with the analysis and research as well. So definitely all done.
Yeah, definitely appreciate those ideas. And then, so finally, we did just want to highlight some of the existing resources that you might want to check out if this is a topic that you're passionate about as well. So there are already AES guidelines for the ethical conduct of evaluations. And I would say, I think they swing a little bit more into that formal ethics, but still, this is a great product that's been around for a while now. And so it's worth taking a look at that, particularly if you're newer in your evaluation career, to give you some sense of what ethical conduct looks like from the evaluation community's perspective. There's also another document from the American Evaluation Association, which provides some guiding principles. Again, really, really handy and practical, worth a look. And then finally, this one doesn't have a pretty picture, but this is one that's available on Better Evaluation, which if you're new to the evaluation community, This is an absolute goldmine of resources. So Better Evaluation, which started in Australia, is now an international resource. There's a heap of things you can look at. We did a bit of sifting through what was available on their site, and particularly thought this resource around evaluation ethics from IPDET, so Evaluation Ethics, Policy Standards and Guiding Principles, was another great resource. So if you do want to do more reading, as I said, this isn't a topic where we're coming in from scratch. There's quite a bit out there as well. But we do just want to keep this conversation going about what about some of the other things that come up in your practical experience that we might want to touch on as well. I think there's an interesting point in chat too, that a lot of these issues also cross over with integrity and quality. So it really is, there's probably a language thing there in terms of whether we consider these ethical dilemmas, they feel ethical when you're facing them, or whether they're really about the integrity of how you practice your craft. But whatever language we land on, I think there's definitely something there that that we've got kind of a growing community of people who say, yeah, this is worth us getting right. And so then we just had a final slide, just giving that final call to action. We'd love your help if you're open to participating. And particularly if you're interested in participating in a case study interview, we'd love to dig a little bit deeper about what happens in practice, because that's the bit that we also don't think is well documented, is the back and forth that happens as an evaluator with a commissioner when you do have these situations come up. And I'm conscious we're getting close to time where we want to do Q&A, but just to give a sense, to share some of my own experiences as an internal evaluator in a government department, I definitely have been asked at some points, because of commercial arrangements, to adjust findings so that we're not getting in a situation where we create an impossible situation with a funded agency. And as I said, I think that really straddles a few categories, but it's really when you look under the hood of that, what does that mean? What are the implications? So you have passed on your findings, the organisation has heard them and absorbed them and acted on them, but you've chosen not to publicly release them because it creates a real challenge out there in the world. I think there's a lot of complexity in that, and that's much harder than any kind of formal ethical guideline will step you through about, you know, how far would you push to insist those findings are released as originally drafted, or how much would you say, look, I accept that you still need an arrangement with that funded agency to deliver essential services to the community, and therefore it's worth preserving your relationship. And that's the kind of richness and complexity we're trying to explore through the case study interviews as well. So that's it for our formal presentation. I'm conscious we have a lot of really rich material in the chat, and I don't know, Sue-Ann, is there anything you wanted to particularly pull out that might be worth a bit further discussion? Or anyone who'd like to, you're most welcome to come off mute and speak to. If there's something you've popped in the chat that you'd like to raise as well, feel free to put your hand up.
I'll also say as well, I've seen out the corner of my eye, someone has reached out and said, I'd love to help with this project. So for others as well that are fascinated, we've got a very loose coalition. So anyone that's interested in joining our working group of conspirators, let us know. We're not very formal, we're not very structured, we're not very organised at all. So if you want to come along and help us sift through the data and make sense of this, you know, the more the merrier as well.
Absolutely. And I wonder, not to put you on the spot too much, but Kate Williams, I'm conscious that I think the points you've raised around language are really, really interesting. And I'd love to hear a bit more. Perhaps it seems that you've got a bit of a background in research integrity. Would you be open to coming off mute and just talking a little bit about your experience as well?
I can try. I'm Kate. Hello. And I did work at the University of Wollongong for a long time. While I was there, I was a research integrity officer, so I actually was exposed to the literature on research integrity. Now, I know I'm very familiar with the difference between research and evaluation. I've been doing this for 20 years. But there is actually a difference. When I decided to come along to this, everyday ethics, to me, conjured up something quite different to what you're actually talking about. So everyday ethics for me is about, you know, what happens when you conduct an interview with somebody and they maybe become distressed or unwell during the interview. Those kinds of issues about participants, to me, that's the ethics side of it. But when you started talking about ethical dilemmas, then it made sense. So, and we all have these ethical dilemmas. The stuff you're talking about is very familiar to me, and I really think it is worth looking at and pursuing. I think it's slightly subversive of you to do this, I can understand why you call yourselves conspirators. Yeah, and I am very, very interested in it. And now I guess as time went on, I began to understand you're talking about ethical dilemmas and those situations when it doesn't feel quite right. You're not really sure what to do. And I do actually think there is a role for clarifying some of those dilemmas and empowering evaluators in those situations. So yes, that's
That's
all
a
I was
great
gonna
point. So
say.
maybe we really need to think about also how we bring it. Like, I think your point around the language of integrity probably resonates more around from a research perspective. So we should think about whether we want to try and pose it as integrity as evaluators, and how to manage ethical dilemmas might be a bit more explicit. I think you make a good point. I have seen some great sessions. I know actually I might call on Jo Van Twest Farmer as well, who's done some great sessions on trauma-informed evaluation. And I think there is a real there's a lot to deal with in that space too, about how do you manage the ethics of interviewing when there's challenging topics.
A specific skill set as well. So I think part of the whole thing and my interest in those self-ratings about people's comfort levels is we've got a whole spectrum here, from novice to emerging to experienced to expert evaluators. So for those that haven't come across it or might be the only evaluator within their organisation, where do they go? They can't necessarily talk to their boss about these issues. Where do they go? And that's where we saw there was a bit of a dearth of material and guidance and support in this space.
That's right, and support might be part of it as well. I might, as I said, Jo Van Twest Farmer, I'm getting used to your new surname. I like it.
Yeah,
so long.
It's interesting in your view too, just in terms of that, how we're coming at not releasing findings, putting it in the moderate. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your experiences in that space?
It's hard to talk about it without thinking through how to de-identify things in advance. I think it ties in with something else that I've been thinking while you've been talking, which is about the way that these ethical dilemmas play out depends on your positionality as the evaluator. And I think there is a big difference in how you manage those ethical dilemmas depending on all the other things that are wrapped up in that. And I'm probably not explaining that very well, but like as an independent consultant and as a sole trader, I think I've given an example before. The way that the not publishing findings is often presented is basically as either you change the findings and we publish them what we want them to be, or we don't publish them, we don't acknowledge the work that's gone into that. And sometimes that's also tied to we don't pay you until we're happy with what the report says. And that is a fundamentally different situation to manage if you're a sole trading evaluator compared to certainly if you're an independent salary an internal salaried evaluator, but even also if you're somebody working in a bigger company where you can manage, okay, we might make a loss on this project, but it kind of balances out across everything. And I don't quite know where I'm going with the thought, but it feels like the not releasing findings, and the reason I think it's interesting that it was lowered down, is often used as an ultimatum. Or that's what I've experienced that on multiple occasions. And because it's being used in that like exploitative way, it's not just a case of we're not going to publish it. It's like, we're not going to publish this unless you change things. So yeah, I've probably not explained that very well because I've been working.
That's a very good point. I think that is absolutely
yeah.
And maybe that's it. Maybe we're actually probably conflating two things. So because there's one thing which is we don't think we can release because there's either commercial challenges that it creates, or there's questions of anonymity that we could get challenged on because of the scale of it. You know, there probably are legitimate reasons to propose not releasing. I think we had one point in the chat too, which says it's probably a bigger deal for government evaluations. It's interesting, I've just come back to the UK where I met with the UK Evaluation Task Force, which has just released their evaluation registry. And so they've actually got a little bit of teeth now through some regulation which says you have to defend if you're not releasing an evaluation, and we don't quite have anything like that in Australia, but we're going to develop a similar evaluation repository for Australian government evaluations, but we don't have any mandate to release. We're just trying to create a culture and an expectation that, particularly anything the ACE partners on, that there's an expectation that they will be released.
Yeah.
Jo, you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say also related to that, there's the like not ethical to who question of this. Like, I think everything that we focused on a fair bit has been focused on the ethical dilemma as experienced by the evaluator. But I think your point there about sharing like government evaluations ties into something else that I've been thinking about. Like the space that I do evaluation work in often requires people to share deeply personal traumatic stories. And the deal as part of that is often that you say, we're going to use these findings to make the world a better place and to make sure that nobody else has to ever go through what you've gone through. And what we then see all too often is that doesn't actually happen, and it gets shelved, and there's that gross feeling, frankly, of having exploited somebody's story to deliver a product that actually hasn't done what it said it's going to do. And I think that's part of it as well that makes me feel like it might be a moderate impact for me in my career if something's not published, but it's actually a quite serious ethical issue if we're telling people that their stories matter and then they don't.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
Yeah. I agree. So that's the sort of feedback that we want to see and hear, like through this process, like this webinar and the survey. I think in my mind, you've made the strong case for moving up that framework to major, because I couldn't agree more, Jo. Like in terms of one of the things I see most commonly is, yeah, we'll publish the report. Oh, wait, there's a slightly constructive comment buried on page 89. No, we won't publish the whole thing. And then you do feel like you've lied. You do feel like you've betrayed people's trust because you're the one out there and you're in good faith saying, yes, this will be published. Keep an eye on the website at this stage. You know, and then you are stuck in that gross space, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we hand to Cassie. And Cassie, it's good. I'm glad to see your hand up as well, because I was going to ask, you've made some really interesting points about potential research approaches in the chat. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about that as well.
Hi. Yeah, I put my hand up, but actually, Jo, you kind of made the point that I was going to make around like whose rights are we referring to? I say that from I guess an organisation could decide, oh, I don't want to release that report because the downstream effects would be quite negative, which will have, you know, maybe ethical or moral implications for the people in the organisation, rather than it be a kind of oh, we want to hide the result. So I wondered if actually maybe there's something around in the contract, there's kind of like an upfront kind of a bit like moral rights, you know, it's kind of like, okay, so this is the moral stance on the report. If it affects like this or this or this or this, or in these particular ways, then we have the right to not publish the report, or we will share a limited redacted part of the report so that everyone up front isn't kind of, you know, everyone's aware up front of what kind of issues there might be, rather than it be after the fact that, you know, I'm disappointed my results are published. So, you know, guidelines around what that might look like, because I don't think it's always necessarily like, oh, we should, obviously in a great world, you'd share everything or whatever, but there are, I guess, other ethical sort of issues that might roll out of something that we don't know up front because we haven't done the research yet. But yeah, sorry. You would, the points I was making around just the self-efficacy in the chat. Yeah, I'd love to be able to see, say if you like measured participants' self-efficacy in like sort of ethics and also with your partners who you're working with, how on the scale they would match with like their confidence to saying, you know, calling people out, and whether or not that information would actually help with the approach that you would have that organisation. So, for example, if they're like really, you know, high levels of risk, they are not unethical, but like, you know, they might bend the rules slightly or whatever, then maybe actually it means that your contract would be slightly different. Maybe you would have like more protections in there for you as an organisation to be able to make sure that that, you know, you're covered in case this, because it's more likely to come up. Or maybe you'd have the conversation up front with them around, okay, look, you know, we've done these kind of tests or whatever, and you know, I'm, you know, you've got a low risk appetite, so or high risk appetite, so therefore we'll act like this instead. So I wonder if there's ways that you could build in checks and balances into your approach of working with an organisation so that you can kind of, avoid these things.
Yeah, I like that sort of idea of having more transparency up front, because that provides the framework. There are some of these issues that are unavoidable, particular political reasons and other real world considerations. But just having the transparency, I think it's about bringing it out of that murky grey and into the light, which reminded me as well, Eleanor, you said there's no repository, and I just remembered there are a couple at sort of state and NGO level. So a shout out to the New South Wales DQ, Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. They publish their evaluation reports, and Reach Out Australia does as well, and there's probably many others. But there are good practices, which is wonderful.
And I should be clear, we will be launching an Australian Government Evaluation Library under some name. We're still debating the name if anyone wants to weigh into the title of that repository. I think we had a lot of interest in it being called a library as to kind of signal this point that it is about a resource that you can explore. Now, the one other point in the chat that I'd love to hear from is just Janet Conti. You just because I think this might be the counterpoint to what Cassie was talking about there too, is the challenges from the commissioner's perspective when there's a tension between the commissioner and the consultant, and if there's been inappropriate presentation of data by a consultant, what ethical dilemma that creates for the commissioner. Janet, do we still have you online? Are you able to speak to that one? And sorry if I'm putting anyone on the spot. I know sometimes people are listening while they're driving or in the middle of things as well, cooking dinner.
And it's not coming off mute, so I might be a bit cheeky because Emma Williams, I see you on the line, and so Emma's been floating around our brains trust as well. I know you're in the UK at the moment, so might not be able to come on. But what have you found from your previous research? So Emma's actually doing a PhD into this topic, evaluation ethics as well. What's your sort of pitch for, you know, what we should all be cognizant of in terms of everyday ethics challenges and consider?
In 50 words or less?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think it is incredibly complex. I'm really glad that people are paying attention to it. I was fascinated with what France Bright said about, as a human rights-based evaluator, I don't find some ethical scenarios to be dilemmas at all because my responsibility is towards beneficiaries. I've been present at some Canadian meetings where they were talking about, do we have responsibilities as well to struggling providers and to small organizations that are doing their best? If there are evaluands, are we creating relationships with them that we also respect as well as the beneficiaries? And I think this is not an area that is black and white. You know, because we've been talking for a while on the Brains Trust, that I've got some real concerns about the American approach and continue to have questions about the American approach. The Canadian approach, I think, is really interesting that they're taking, but it's very different. And I think it's really difficult to put into practice, where they're saying, instead of having these principles that we're going to try to apply consistently, we appreciate that when we go into an evaluation, it's got all these stakeholders. And what we need to do is together work out for all of us, how can we all behave ethically with participants, with the participants/beneficiaries, with the organizations, with the commissioner. Let's agree on how we will all behave ethically. And they're trying to build up the skills of evaluators in negotiating that, understanding what these issues are, talking with them, trying to smooth that. I think it's fantastic, but I also think that it's almost utopian, because I think, and I've started to write to them about, what about this situation? Because I've been collecting all these ethical situations. Well, what about this one? Would it work in that one? Because I'm not sure it would. So I guess the short answer is I'm fascinated by this. I'm happy to work in any way on it. And I think we've got a long journey ahead of us.
Yeah, look, that's a great summary. And look, I think we're very close to time. So we might even take that as our final word, because it was so articulate, Emma. Thank you so much for your contribution. I'll just re-emphasize too, like I hope the next steps have been really clear for everyone who participated today. We'd love you to participate in the survey. We've still got it open for another couple of weeks, and if you can share with your networks, it'll help give us the depth we're after if you're happy to volunteer for a case study interview, I think that's where we're going to get a lot of those really deep insights. So very keen to have as many people participate as possible. And if you would like to be working on this too, please feel free to reach out to me or Kristy. If it's the easiest way, you can also just write to ACE. We've got a pretty good website, which is evaluation@treasury.gov.au is sometimes the easiest way to get in touch if you would like to follow up a little bit. And look, thank you for your participation. We hope to see you at the AES conference, if not before. And just really appreciate you getting online in the evening. These sessions are no good without participation, and we hope you've got a lot of value out of it as well. So thanks for joining us.